keep us afloat. We retreat into our fortress, go to a sanctuary in the trees that I call home, trees that I call day. Arise in solitude, I will stray to find the root from the vine that saved my life, the beam from the light that gave me sight, a glimpse of what I call home. Stay the course and through the brushwood break. Briar and thorns adorn the trail we make. So climb the storms uprooted crowns with haste, and plunge into the tannic acid stains. Plunge into the day. Arrives in solitude, I will stray to find the root from the vine that saved my life, a beam from the light that gave me sight, a glimpse of what I call home. Down to the black water in we go, for to emerge with a gift for you. Colony lost that will be restored. Float down the river, she'll be yours. Down to the black water in we go, for to emerge with a gift for you. Colony lost that will be restored. Float down the river and she'll be yours. Day arrives in solitude, I will stray to find a root from the vine that saved my life, a beam from the light that gave me sight, a glimpse of what I call home. swaying from an old clothesline like a wasn't difficult to pull me from myself again. And in our travels, we found the roads. You held it like a mirror, showing me the life I chose. And I returned to my beautiful city. Black skies have changed into blue. And my love is so wise and so pretty. But some nights I still dream of you. Dear fellow traveler under the moon, I think I'm growing weary and I'm hoping you'll come soon. And if I see you in clean new clothes, I hope you hold the mirror up to show me what I chose. And I'll return to my beautiful city. Black skies will change into blue. And oh, my love is so wise and so pretty. Some nights I'll still dream of you.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Discovery Church. Will you guys stand with us as we sing many, many songs?
Of sin and darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger. The King of glory, the King above all names, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder, who leaves us breathless in awe and wonder. The King of glory, the King. never runs out on me. Your love, yeah. On it goes. Oh, it overwhelms and satisfies my soul. And I never ever have to be afraid. This one thing remains. This one thing remains. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your in death, in life, I'm confident and covered by the power of your great love. My debt is paid. There's nothing that can separate my heart from your great love. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love, and it goes on and on. And it goes on and on. Yeah. Your love goes on and on. Oh yeah. Your love goes on and on. Oh yeah. Goes on and on and on and on and it grows. Oh, it overwhelms and satisfies my soul. And I never ever have to be afraid. This one thing remains. This one thing remains. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love never fails and never gives up, never runs out on me. Your love, yeah. There's nothing worth more that could ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, Lord. And I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, where my heart becomes free and my shame is undone, all because of your presence.
to a time of communion this morning. This is how we choose to recognize the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. How we choose to show our gratitude that we can come to a place like this and that we can experience our God, that we can be present with the Holy Spirit. That in every moment of our lives we have this unmitigated access to our God. And we come here to celebrate that that wasn't always the way. That there was a time when our sin and our iniquity kept us from God. When there was this measure of perfection that we had to reach to be able to draw near to him. This impossible measure of perfection, and there was a veil between us and him. There was a boundary. There was a line that we could not cross. And we come here to celebrate that our God looked at that system and said, that is not good enough. That our God said, I know they don't measure up to the perfection. I know they have all of this baggage, but I want them with me. I want to have relationship with each and every one of them. And so he came as a man, and he hung on a cross, and he bled, and he died, and he paid the price to make each of us clean, and he tore that veil. He destroyed that boundary. He destroyed that line. He allowed us to have this access to him. He allowed us to come with all of our sin, with all of our baggage, with all of our iniquity, and bring it to the table. And there was a seat prepared for each of us. So if you're unfamiliar, what's going to happen is a tray is going to go up and down the aisle with a wafer and a cup of juice. Take one of each of those. Take it on your own time. We're not going to come back up and do it together. But let this be a moment of stillness and of silence to remember what was done for you. So many of us have spent the last 7 days without even one time slowing down, just to be still. Just to remember the reality that God is all around us. And even if you walked in here this morning and you don't know where you stand with the whole God thing, the whole Jesus thing, you still probably haven't taken just a few minutes to just sit and be. All of us are so busy and so hectic. We can all benefit from just slowing down a little bit. If you've never been here with us before, you're going to hear those little plastic cups shattering all around the room, and it is a tangible reminder that it is finished. That the work of the cross was the final word, that that old system was defeated and will never be put back together. Shatter these cups, we enter into an agreement with Jesus when he hung on the cross and said, it is finished. It's finished. The work is done. We no longer have to measure up to perfection, which frees us to be good. And if all of this is super weird and you don't know what I'm talking about and you want nothing to do with it and it seems a little weird and esoteric and culty, there's no shame in that. Just pass it on to the next person. There will be an opportunity to ask questions later if you'd like to ask any questions. But for now, just keep the tray moving. You're safe and welcome, and we're super thrilled that you are here. So let's pray for that together, and then we'll share in that meal. God, we come before you humbled that you could have kept the old system in place. You could have forced this measure of perfection on us. You could have demanded things of us. And we would have tried and we would have failed. But you could have left that system in place. But you didn't. We come humbled and aware that you paid such an enormous price to break that system apart and give us grace. Give us an opportunity to sit at your table. And all we have to do is reach out and take it. You don't ask anything of us other than just agreeing with you about who we are. So God, in this moment we ask that you remind us who we are. Remind us what you've done for us. And in your name we pray. Amen. stand with us as we sing one last song together?
So come alive. devil right beside me. Rising with the morning sun. It's the hunger that drives me. Oh Lord, send my soul, take my pain and turn it into gold. 'Cause all I know is champion. I can take a beating now, rise again, running through the jungle until the end. I can live forever, I'll rise again, keep rising up. I'm champion. I can take a beating now, rise again, running through the jungle until the end.
Wow. Good morning. I'm super excited because I'm about to head out of here and hit the mountains with my wife for our 21st anniversary. But if you're heading out of town, you're probably doing what I'm doing. We're watching like all the forest fires and everything. So I think we can thank God for the rain that we got. Yeah. Although last night, first service, 4 o'clock service, the hail and the volume of hail, it's like the first time I've ever probably not been heard in my life. So, my job is simple today. It's super simple. I am here to make you desperately wish that Greg Lindsay is back. So, that's my central idea. If you walk away with that takeaway, perfect. My name is Pete Einiger, and I'm the executive pastor here at DCC. And I know what you're saying, how this big, huge, ugly mug become an executive pastor. And as I was going through studying this week, I thought about that. I remember when I was 21 years old and I was at Mankato State University in Minnesota. And, yeah, all right, Midwesterners, feel safe now. But I'm standing there and I'm at school, I'm 21, I'm young, and I hate the church. And I can't stand it. And I don't like the Christians, most of the Christians that I had met up to that point in time. Didn't like it. So how did I get there? How did I get to a place where I'm so young and yet I have all of this anger towards Christians in the church? Well, I grew up a Baptist pastor's kid. Yeah. I hear all the PK stuff. My dad preached in the Baptist church for 48 years. And if you grew up Baptist or knew a Baptist or rubbed up against a Baptist at some point in time, or you looked across the parking lot at their church and saw a Baptist, you know that if I was a pastor's kid, I went to church about 4 or 5 times a week, right? We had Sunday school on Sunday morning, and then I had Sunday AM, Sunday evening, Wednesday night. But just so that we could kind of have the spiritual landscape and have like the highest order among all other churches, we did Thursday night visitation, where we went out and knocked on doors and went to the hospital. So that's how I grew up. So if I grew up going to youth group and going to Sunday school and being in church almost my whole life, how did I end up at 21 hating the church? And for a lot of my life, as many of you, you have to contemplate your story, right? That's one of the first things that we talk about here is discover your story, right? And when I think back on my story, I could probably name a number of things, but I wanted to talk about a few. And the first one is, when I was a kid, growing up in the Baptist church, I had this distorted image of God. And he was up on this throne, he was super far away. He had like this gray hair, long beard, and he looked really curmudgeon-y. And he was always wagging his finger at me, because somehow I couldn't be good. And in the Baptist church, we'd kind of drawn this circle, right? And there was kind of like these prerequisites or this bullet list, or there was a checklist, and it was a description of how Christians are supposed to look and act and behave. And then there's this other list that we had. And that list is a list of things that definitely get you sent directly to hell right away. And so most of my life, I somehow did more of the second list than I did the first list. And so what I ended up doing is I grew up, even as a young kid, all the way up until I was like 17, 18 years old in high school, always saying the sinner's prayer at night. Because I felt like, you'd sit there and doubt your salvation. I'm not in the circle. I can't measure up. I don't have those qualities about me. And so I must not have been fully committed. I must not have really believed. I really must not have trusted Jesus. And so again and again, over and over, all the way through high school, sinner's prayer, so that I could pray my way back into the circle, only to do the stuff that gets me sent directly to hell the next day. And so there was this seesaw, right? And so that's one thing, a distorted image of God. The second thing was in the 1980s, the economy was going bad, and my dad couldn't find work for a period of time, and he was really struggling, and I didn't know, none of us knew how bad. And he attempted suicide. Those are one of the things on the list of things that get you sent directly to hell. And I look back at it, and there's two sides of it, right? There's this idea of that my dad could never go to church and actually share his story or say that he was struggling or feel safe to say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here. I feel this depression and all these things. We didn't do that. We put on a suit, and we sang hymns, and we acted like everything was great, and then we tried to make it out the door to Church's Fried Chicken or something. So when my dad did that, there was a period of time where my mom and I were alone. And all these people that had been, our friends and family, around us at church, they didn't talk to us anymore. We were kind of like damaged goods. Nobody knew how to address suicide, and it was kind of a dirty word. And then there's Coors Light cans. I had to work it in, sorry. When I was 17 years old, I lived in Forest City, Iowa. It's a town that none of you have ever heard of. And it's a town of 3,200 people. If you've ever seen a Winnebago travel trailer, it was made there. And so that's our big claim to fame there. But like almost every guy my age in high school in Forest City, Iowa, I worked out on a farm. And so I worked at Thompson Seed Farm, and we would pick rock and do all crazy stuff like bale hay and, get on these large beams and go through soybean fields, and we'd learn every single thing like bud and weed and lamb's quarters and all kinds of stuff, and then we'd spray them with Roundup, or we had to pull them, right? And so we would work till about dark, and then we'd go home, quick shower, and then we'd go to Hardee's. Now, for those of you who didn't grow up in the Midwest and don't know what Hardee's is, it's like Carl's Jr., except worse. And so, but it's one of only three restaurants in town, so that's where we hung out. So one time, I am there, and my buddy meets me, and he's like, hey, bro, we just had a family reunion, and my dad left a bunch of beer in a cooler. It's in the back of the truck. You want to drink some beer? I'm like, yeah. So, remember, this is the 80s. He had his jean jacket on, so he starts stuffing the inner pockets with Silver Bullet till it's like exploding. And then he jumps in my 1987 Grand Am, and then he does something inexplicable to me that I still don't understand to this day. He proceeds to take all the Coors Light out and put it on the floorboard of my passenger side of the vehicle, which will be an important fact later. So, what we do in Iowa is we go out town, hit the gravel road, right? We find a creek, because a creek always had a concrete bridge over it, and the railings were made out of concrete, and they're about 3.5 feet tall, and you could always sit your keister down and just sit there and drink beer. So that's what we had intended to do. The problem with that is that I failed to recognize that my Grand Am had a headlamp out. And so as I pulled out of the Hardee's parking lot, Officer Gregory Beaver decided to pull me over for that infraction. Then comes up and it's dark, right? He has that big flashlight and he shines that light and I'm almost blinded by the glint off the Coors Light silver bullets on the floorboard. So he's like, all right, boys, you're going to have to get out of the car. Then he proceeds to do this wonderful thing. 2 cans at a time up on top of my roof. Now, if you grew up in the Midwest or a small town, you know that I'm not lying when I tell you that at least one car from every single household in Forest City drove by the Baptist preacher's kid getting busted for drinking beer. And I'm pretty sure that some of the Lutheran folks had their little disc camera and they were like taking pictures of me as I went by. Yeah. But it wasn't that made me hate the church. It was a couple of weeks later, because I'd really learned my lesson, right? I was out at another party outside of town. Yep. Yeah. In the 80s, minor possession was $23. You didn't even have to go to court. So there you go. Just wanted you to know that. Wasn't that big of a deal. I just paid it and went to party. At the party, my buddy Jim had this sweet 1978 Monty SS 454 Krager rims. It was beautiful. And the only reason why I say that is because of this. If you're a muscle car guy, you know that a lot of the muscle cars have this smaller seat. Like Trans Am doesn't really have a back seat. But a Monty has a huge back seat. And if you're a wayward teenage boy, you do things in that back seat. Not so good things. But it's not so much what Jim was doing, but who he was educating back there was our head deacon's daughter. So at the very same time that Jim was putting on a clinic, her dad was meeting with my dad to tell him that he wouldn't no longer be preaching at Calvary Baptist Church. My parents didn't really like that. And so they're conservative, and they kind of disfellowshipped me. And they moved to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And all the kids that were in youth group with me didn't hang out with me. I don't even know if the Lutherans really hung out with me anymore. But I end up going to college, and I hate church. I can't stand it. I just hate it. And I hate Christians. So I was more than happy to just party every weekend, hang out with my friends, and not have anything to do with Christianity, Jesus, or church. Until something happened when I was 21. A person came into my life, and I was able to change. But before I tell you about that, I wanted to grasp, I want you to understand where I was. So there's a video that we're going to play now, and I want you to watch this as you get an idea of where I was.
I hate church. So I won't be fooled into believing she is beautiful. It's easy to see through her brokenness. Her comfort is more important than how she shows the love of Christ. She is hopeless, and no longer do I feel there is grace within her. The church is beyond repair, and it is foolish to accept that she can change. People say she is no longer relevant. Her biggest deception is she is full of grace. How much hope is in her? She's blinded to what hurts her. I can see the church so clearly, and it will take a lot for me to believe I am mistaken. The evidence shows she does not care about the poor, and who am I to say this is wrong? The church is a lost cause, and I just can't say I forgive church. But what if I could? and I just can't say the church is a lost cause. This is wrong. And who am I to say she does not care about the poor? The evidence shows I am mistaken, and it will take a lot for me to believe I can see the church so clearly. What hurts her? She is blinded to how much hope is in her. She is full of grace. Her biggest deception is she is no longer relevant. People say she can change, and it is foolish to accept that the church is beyond repair. There is grace within her, and no longer do I feel she is hopeless. How she shows the love of Christ is more important than her comfort. Through her brokenness, it's easy to see she is beautiful. So, I won't be fooled into believing I hate church.
When I was 21, there's this kid who grew up with me. And his name was Chad Prigge. Chad knew all the choices that I'd made. He knew that I hated church. He knew that I wasn't going. He knew that I didn't even want to talk about it. He didn't come to me and say, hey, bro, let's get into a Bible study. He didn't come up to me and say, hey, why don't you come back to church? He didn't try to talk sense into me. He didn't try to sit down with me and confront me. He had one goal, was to be my friend. And Chad helped open my heart so that I could hear other voices through the rest of my life that helped me to forgive church. Because I recognized something from Chad that is true about me as much as it was the people who caused me pain. When we lead with judgment, we invite judgment. When we set prerequisites and standards, and the very first thing that somebody does when they come in contact with a church or a Christian or somebody who's a follower of Jesus is to show them how different they are, how broken they are, or how far away from God they are. If we lead with judgment, we invite judgment. And there are people groups that some of you might have had in your heritage. You've been told that we need to stay away from them, or they're bad news, or they're progressive, or whatever, right? And we have done more to invite them to hate us than to love us. And when they hate us, it also poorly reflects Jesus. And that's true of me as much as it was the people who caused me pain. I do the same circles, right? I have my same little checklist. I have a little thing that I go through. But this message is about rebels, so I want to introduce you to one. His name is Naaman. Now, if you grew up in church most of your life, you may have had a Sunday school class or some type of story, or VeggieTales, I can't remember if they did one, about Naaman. And Naaman was the second most influential person in the country of Syria at the time. He was the right-hand man of King Aram. And actually, when we come to meet him in 2 Kings chapter 5, God is already using him to dole out judgment against the kingdom of Israel because Israel is unfaithful and they're not following him. But Naaman has a problem. Naaman has a skin disease, and it's called leprosy. And that disease was nasty in those days, right? I mean, it rotted your flesh. It made you smell. People thought it was contagious. They didn't want to be around you. And so you can imagine that Naaman probably tried every single thing that he could possibly do to get rid of it, right? So every single time that he had a skirmish against another people group, he would go into their temples and worship their God in hopes that their God could heal him. He would go to his own temple, the temple of Rimmon, and he would bow down to Rimmon in hopes that he could find healing. And he probably rubbed every single thing known to man all over his body to get rid of it. And I am positive that he had like 10 or 15 friends on Facebook recommend essential oils to him. If you're an essential oil user, I'll be back at the fireplace and you can kick me. But I'm just saying the peppermint oil didn't work for Naaman. He exhausted all his resources. But in one of his skirmishes with Israel, he saved this girl's life, his little servant girl. She was Jewish. And he saved her life. And she, of course, heard of his problem and his attempts to try to get healing. And she says, man, I wish that you could meet this prophet, Elisha. He's in Samaria. So right away, Naaman runs over to King Ammon, and he's like, hey, can I go? I got to try this. I'm desperate. And King's like, yep, absolutely you can go. In fact, I'll send a letter ahead of you. And it's kind of funny. If you read through 2 Kings, the king of Israel is an unfaithful king, and he is literally a wuss. He is getting conquered left and right and everything. And so I just always try to picture what it's like to have this letter show up from the king of Syria, this big, huge, powerful nation. And he's like, hey, I'm sending my, general. And by the way, you need to heal him. And he's probably, and the Bible tells us he was freaking out. He's like, oh, I can't even heal any of the lepers in our own land. What am I supposed to do with Naaman? And then Elisha goes, I got this. And that's where Naaman wanted to go anyway, right? And so Naaman travels. He's brought a bunch of people with him, and he travels, and he ends up on Elisha's doorstep. Now, Elisha's kind of a pretty big dude, right? He's a big deal. Now, he's not really liked in Israel because he's always pronouncing judgment and condemnation on unfaithful people, so he's not really liked. He's not got a fan club. But he's a pretty big deal. He's a mouthpiece of God. He doesn't come out to meet Naaman. So right away, they're not starting out on great feet, right? Naaman is probably pretty ticked off. I traveled all this way. I'm kind of a big deal. And Naaman's not even going to come outside. Elisha's not going to come outside. Elisha sends a guy. And the guy comes out and he's like, hey, you just dip in the Jordan River 7 times, you're going to be healed of your leprosy. And right away, Naaman is just ticked off, right? He is so mad. Because first, he was insulted because Elisha doesn't come out. But then he's told he has to bathe in the Jordan River 7 times. And he's like, good grief. I've got all kinds of rivers in Syria that are crystal clean. Like I got Mount Princeton hot springs that I could bathe in. And if I bathed in that, I actually might get clean. But if I jump in the Jordan, I'm probably going to be worse off than what I was before. But then his people approach him, and they're like, dude, we just came all the way from Syria. And I'm pretty sure that if he had asked you to conquer 10,000 armies, you would have jumped on your horse and said, giddy up, let's do this. If he had asked you to climb some tall peak and do something heroic or challenging, you would have risen to the occasion and you would do it. But he asked this simple thing of you, and seriously, we're travel all the way here and you're not going to do it? So they convinced Naaman to dip in the Jordan River 7 times. So let's pick up the story in 2 Kings chapter 5, starting in verse 14. So he did it. He went down and immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times, following the orders of the prophet, and his skin was healed. It was like the skin of a little baby, and he was good as new. He then went back to the prophet, he and his entourage, and he stood before him, and he said, I now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no God anywhere on earth other than the God of Israel. And in gratitude, let me give you a gift. And Elisha refuses the money. So Naaman says, I have one request and I have one question. If you grew up watching VeggieTales or Flannel Graphs, you kind of stop the story at he's healed, yay. But these 2 things are super important part of this story. The first is he says, I want to take dirt back to Syria with me. Because during that time, right, they always associated deities with a certain territory. And so this was the God of Israel. And he says, I recognize God as the only true God. He says, in fact, from this point forward, every time I sacrifice, every time I worship, every time I do anything, it's only going to be to the God of Israel. And so I want to bring this dirt back so that when I make those sacrifices, I can do it on his soil. And so Elisha's like, yeah, knock yourself out. It's dirt, right? Like, take as much as you want. In fact, you didn't have to ask. It's free. But he goes, but I have a question. You see, when I get back to Syria, the king of Ramon is really old. He's going to ask me to help him into the temple. Or the king Amon is really old. He's going to ask me to come to the temple of Ramon. And I'm going to have to help him. I'm going to bow down before Ramon. And I want to know something. When I bow down before Ramon, and it's super important, you want to hear the answer that Elisha gives because it's super important. Everything will be fine. Shalom. Go in peace. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that so significant for us? And we're going to find out because Jesus is going to refer back to that story. He's going to refer back to Naaman in a completely different context. But the second point that I want to make, remember the first one is when we lead with judgment, we invite judgment. The second point that I want to make is we tend to draw circles and Jesus draws people. We tend to draw circles and Jesus draws people. So let's go to Luke chapter 4 and beginning in verse 13, and let's read this passage. It says, Jesus returned to Galilee, powerful in the Spirit. News that he was back spread through the countryside, and he taught in their meeting places to everyone's acclaim and pleasure. Then he came to Nazareth, where he had been reared. As he always did on the Sabbath, he went to the meeting place, and when he stood up to read, he was handed the scroll from the prophet Isaiah. And unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written, God's Spirit is on me. He's chosen me to preach the message of good news to the poor, sent me to announce pardon to prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the burdened and battered free, to announce this is God's year to act. He rolled up the scroll, and he handed it back to the assistant, and he sat down, and every eye in the place was on him intently, and then he started in. You've just heard Scripture make history. It came true just now in this place. And all who were there watching and listening were surprised at how well he spoke. But they also said, isn't this Joseph's son, the one we've known since he was a youngster? And he answered, I suppose that you're going to quote from some proverb and say, physician or doctor, go heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what we heard that you did in Capernaum. Well, let me tell you something. No prophet has ever been welcome in his hometown. Isn't it a fact that there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah during that 3.5 years of drought when famine devastated the land? But the only widow to whom Elijah was sent was in Sarepta in Sidon. And there were many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, but the only one cleansed was Naaman, the Syrian. Pay attention. That set everyone in the meeting place seething with anger. They threw him out, banished him from the village. They took him to a mountain cliff at the edge of the village to throw him to his doom, but he gave them the slip and he was on his way. What's going on here? Jesus is picking a fight. He's mad. There's two other accounts besides Luke chapter 4. We can pick it up in Matthew and we can pick it up in Mark. They're not as detailed as Luke, but they do give a description that says Jesus was completely flabbergasted or he was completely shocked and angry at their disbelief. And I want you to catch why. You see, he had just read from the scroll of Isaiah and he said, I'm that guy. I'm God. And somehow these guys had the audacity to say, hey, why don't you play David Copperfield or David Blaine and show me a little bit more magic tricks like you did up in Capernaum in Galilee? Why don't you put on a show for us? Why don't you show us? Because we'll need a little bit more before we follow you. And so Jesus is angry at their unbelief. So he reminds them of this time where their descendants, their actual family members, were unfaithful, didn't have any faith. And he picks a little fight, right? He goes back and he goes, hey, do you remember the widow during Elijah's time? See, Elijah had pronounced judgment on the nation of Israel, and there's going to be 3.5 years of famine and drought, no rain. And all the crops are going to shrivel up. And he comes across this widow and he says, I need you to make a cake. And she says, wait, I only got a little bit of oil and a little bit of flour. And after I make the cake for me and my son, that's all we have, and we're just going to wait it out and die because we don't have anything else. We're going to starve. And Elijah says, wait a second. If you'll go in, take that little bit, make me a cake first, and then make yourself and your son a cake, I promise you from this point forward until God sends rain, that oil and that flour will never wear out. It will never run out. And Jesus is pointing back at that widow. Who's the widow? Well, she's not a Jew. She's never going to go to the temple. She's never going to have her copy of Torah and have a Torah study with her small group. She's not going to make sacrifice or have the Levitical priests make sacrifices. She's not going to go through all the motions. She's not even a Jew. She's not a descendant of Abraham. She doesn't have any of that pedigree. She doesn't have anything. And Jesus' whole point is what? You think that you can ask me, the Son of God, to do something extra, to do a few more miracles, then we'll believe. I'm telling you, I'm surprised at your lack of faith because you should have learned your lesson way back here. The whole reason why I've been sent to you is because of your lack of belief that you exhibited there. And remember, it was the woman. Did she have a theology degree? No. Did she participate in Bible study? No. She didn't even know who God was. She had no idea who God was. And imagine, by worldly standards, she did one of the stupidest things ever. She took the last of her food for her and her son, and she cooked a cake for this guy first. But what is in common with her and Naaman? Naaman's the same way, right? Naaman's from Syria. He's not, the prophet Elisha doesn't come out and go, hey, now that you're healed, don't go back to Syria. You're going to have to stay here. We kind of want you to show up every Sabbath at the temple. You're going to have to worship, and I want you to join a few small groups, and you're going to have to clean up your act and stop lusting after foreign women and all this stuff. You're going to have to do all these things. No, Elisha says, go ahead and be theologically incorrect and go and bow down to the temple of Rimmon because you're okay because you just took the only thing that God desires of anyone is a small faith in a person who just wants to take one step further towards God. The widow took a small amount of faith and moved towards God. They both did. And so he's telling the Jews, you've drawn this circle. You think you're inside the circle for some reason. You think that you've got this all cornered because of your heritage and everything, but I'm here to tell you that Naaman and this widow were saved, and your family members died because of lack of faith. Your descendancy, your temple, your obedience, none of those things bought you salvation for me. Naaman came to me with nothing to offer, just faith. It's important, right? Now, Jeff Safford was my sociology professor in college. He probably doesn't remember me at all. I was the guy, way at the back, kind of snoozing. But he would be super proud of me today because I'm going to throw a little sociology in here. And so I'm not going to require you to have this memorized or anything, but there's a couple things that you learn in sociology. We as people tend to have a couple ways in which we work. And one is called a circle-bounded set. And you'll see it up in the diagram here. A circle-bounded set is where we create a boundary. And in the church, it's a theological border. It's a doctrinal fence. It's to separate those who are inside the fence from those who are out. It is an us versus them mentality, where everyone who's on the inside of the circle is accepted and loved and welcomed, and while those on the outside of the fence, right, they're awaiting, they need to have some behavioral changes and modifications before they get in the inside, and they have to fit the entry requirements. Now, I know what you're saying because you're probably a lot like me. You're like, yeah, I knew a Baptist church like Pete grew up in. I know some places here in town. Or I had a friend who went to a church like that. And so we get kind of judgy and self-righteous, right? Because we look at the groups and we're like, yeah, I know those groups that really put really strict rules and they make you clean-shaven and they make you wear a tie. No. I'm talking about DCC. 3 years ago, when I first started volunteering here, I co-led a Thursday night group. And when that group got to be about 20 people, we had a guy who was a convicted pedophile. His first words to me were, "Is my story safe here?" We had a guy who was 72 hours sober from methamphetamines and booze. We had a guy who just 3 days earlier had gotten, just finished a 15-year prison sentence. And the only thing that he really knew anything about and talked about was a certain foot by certain foot cell that he had just spent the last 15 years in. Now, there were some other people in the group that looked a little bit more Christian, right? And they were there and they came. But if it was an open group, right? So people could come and go as they pleased, and we grew, and sometimes it was bigger, and sometimes it was smaller. But during that time period, if one person asked me this question, 20 plus people asked me this question. Hey, is there any other groups at DCC? This one is intense. Like, they've got some serious stories. Like, I don't even know how to relate to those people. This is woo. What were they saying? They wanted to go in a little circle and have a Bible study with people that were like them. They wanted to sit in a group and go through Captivating or Wild at Heart or, be totally devoted to some book study around people that were like them. And what they would tell me is, man, I am so glad that DCC has someone like you who will minister to these people, that will reach out to them, because someday I hope that, they'll get their act together and then we can see them in this little Bible study. There's a second group, second model for sociology, and that model is called a centered set. In that set, there are no boundaries. There are no walls. There's no fence. There's no dividing line between us and them. There's no rules or guidelines to determine who's in and who's out. Everyone is loved, welcomed, and accepted no matter what. Everyone automatically belongs. If you grew up in the heritage that I grew up in, you're asking the question, whoa, wait a second. If we don't have a theological rudder, or we don't have ethics and morals, then aren't we just a bunch of people milling around? And we have no standards. We don't have anything. Like, that seems like chaos. No, because there's something else about the centered set. The centered set is different than just a random mass of people randomly milling around because of what is at the center. A centered set has no boundaries to keep people out, but it does have something compelling in the center which pulls and draws people in. There are no gatekeepers turning people away, for everyone is on equal footing, pulled toward the center. DCC, that's what we're called to. That's what we're supposed to do. You and I, we have a tendency to all draw those circles, and I do it. I look at somebody and I make a rash judgment, and I start to line them up. And let me tell you something about that circle. It's not a picnic being inside the circle, right? Who's at the center of the circle? When I draw the circle, I'm in the center, and you're in the center. And the problem is that we all have these standards, right? So what do I end up doing when I'm in that circle? Well, I try to figure out what you guys have as standards, and then I try to perform those standards in front of you. You see, I want you to think that I meet all those requirements. But you know what the dirty little secret is? I spend my whole life in that circle hiding who I really am. I'm not able to share any of those things with you. I don't share my struggles. I don't anything that is inconsistent with that set of prerequisites. I hide. And it is miserable inside the circle because we put ourselves in a seat that was only intended for one, and it's Jesus. God is the judge. What did he call us into? He called us to be lovers. He called us to love others. He's telling the Jews, listen, you can have temple and law and everything else. You can go through all your feast days. You can go through all your ceremonies. You can be descendants of Abraham. But I think you forgot, right? In Isaiah 1, he says, I found you in the desert bleeding, ready to die. In other words, you had nothing. And what did I do? I took you and I raised you and I clothed you and I adorned you and then I married you. But you, Israel, you spread your leg to every passerby and worshiped all the false gods. In Isaiah 1, he says, with your lips you worship me, and with your hearts you are far away from me. And the Jews drew a circle and said, we get God because of who we are. And Jesus goes, no, you know who gets me? Naaman and the widow. Because they came towards me with a small faith. And they had nothing to offer because nothing is needed. We can't add appendages and prerequisites and requirements to the grace that God freely gives. And we can't put ourselves in the seat that Jesus rightfully should sit. And here's the thing. If that cross is in the center, if I put Jesus in the center of that circle, and he's in the center, there is no circle, there are no boundaries, and I focus on Jesus, what I'm not supposed to do is look to my right and to my left to see if you're moving towards him. I am supposed to be completely and utterly focused with taking more and more steps towards God, allowing God to fill me up with the love and fullness that he is, so that he overflows my cup. And the only thing that people in our community and my daughters and my family and everybody that I meet gets from me is that cup spilling over with love, grace, and mercy and acceptance.
Yep.
That's what we're called to. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 said this, and we'll close with this. He had a checklist that was actually stricter than the one I grew up with. At the beginning, he says, if I could speak with the tongue of men and of angels, and I had all wisdom and all knowledge. Know anyone like that? I don't. But if I did, if I could do all those things, what did Paul say? If I could do all those things, if I had all that knowledge, all that wisdom, and I could speak with the tongue of men and of angels, but I don't have love, it's just religious noise. Pray with me. Jesus, I need to come to you and ask forgiveness because I spent a huge portion of my life drawing circles when you were trying to draw people to you. And I thank you so much that you put a Chad Prigge and then other voices in my life during my journey and during my story who began to open my heart and realize that the very people that I hated and the very people that I wanted to judge so harshly had a lot in common with me. And Father, I pray that as I go from here and as everyone here goes from here, that we would look at our sons and our daughters and our wives and our friends and our family and our coworkers and all the people that you give us an opportunity to meet, and we have one thing to offer, and that's love. Father, forgive us for drawing circles. Forgive us for leading with judgment and having people feel like all they can do is return judgment to us and hate us. Father, help us to put you at the center, be filled with you and you alone, and be focused on that, and then allow you to fill us up and draw people to yourself. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. One of the most beautiful things that you could ever see is if you stop by the office sometime during the week. You might remember Fostering Hope, the group that we helped over Easter, but we have several foster kids who are now working at the church. They're being mentored by staff, and it's just so beautiful to walk around the corner and see them, and they're getting loved on, and we're getting to see them learn some things and stuff like that, and it's so cool. If you want to jump on mission with us, because we try to help lots of groups like Fostering Hope, Exodus Road, and all those things, we don't pass anything around. We're not going to ask you for anything. If you choose to do it, we've got boxes at the back, we've got a website, we've got an app, so you can take care of that there and jump on mission. But we try to give as much as that out the four doors, the four walls of this place, and to others, so that we can make an impact in our community and the world. All right? And if you need to know more about this church, then please go to the garage. And lastly, one more thing. If you're an essential oil user, I'll be by the fireplace. You're dismissed.
Every tune, every scene, spit the bones from your teeth like the ransom.